will rather be on the speakers to put on a good performance to keep the audience awake for the next 2 hours. We're going to have same as in the previous panel, so we will have all the 4 papers, and then we're going to have nice long discussion of 40 minutes in the end. And it's my pleasure to introduce our first speaker, Steenbergen. There will be an introduction, and the title is, no, that is not on there yet, of your paper, but please, you.
Okay. Well, thank you very much, Konrad, for this introduction. Can everyone hear me with this kind of mic in the back as well? No? Otherwise, I have to keep one. Okay. Is this better? Okay. Well, thank you very much for the introduction. Thank you to the organizers, especially the local organizers, John Malloy and his team, for organizing this 4th session of the School of Mamluk Studies and for accepting our panel in it. Thank you to our co-panelists who accepted my invitation and to Konrad, who was willing to chair. This panel, as the title indicates, focuses on late medieval Arabic historiography, on how that vast corpus of highly significant historiographical texts is increasingly opening up for research from new literary, social, and cultural perspectives. And the 4 papers in this panel, I think, offer 4 different cases in point for such a statement. In my own paper, I will focus on the Arabic historiographical tradition of 15th century Egypt, on the Chronicles of Al-Makrizi, Al-Aini, and Ibn Tahribirdi in particular, on how they engaged with their contemporary worlds. I don't think there's any need in this particular context to introduce the Suluk, the Aikt, the Hawadith, and the Nujum. I will just limit myself to repeat the well-known fact that this is a highly interrelated group of scholars and texts, in social and political terms, as well as in textual terms. That we're dealing here with a historiographical corpus that has been defining imaginations of the history of Egypt ever since its production in the 15th century. Now, these authors and their texts display a remarkably shared concern for opening most of their contemporary annals with an update on the year's ruling elites. Now, in this paper, I will say a few words about these snapshots of a year's hierarchies of power, these lists of rulers and officials. And I will briefly consider precedents and intertextualities, finally reflecting on why these lists and their very spatial concerns may have been allowed to interrupt the strictly chronographic organization of these chronicles. It will actually be argued that the actual nature of these lists as they appeared in some 15th century chronicles was something of a novelty in chronicle writing, and that these Egyptian chronicles thus participated actively in what Zaide Antrim recently called a politics of place, or even a discourse of place, a discourse that operated on various scales and shifted from representations of individual cities in the 13th century to representations of the Sultanate as a spatial whole in the 14th century. It will actually be argued here that in this 15th century case of these chronicles, that discourse had shifted further, far beyond Egypt and Syria, but not necessarily beyond the idea of the Sultanate as an integrated political space. In general, or to give you a general idea of these hierarchies of power listed in the Al-Makrizi's Suluk, in Al-Aini's Ikt, and even in Ibn Tahribirdi's Hawadith and Nujum, all of these lists always appear at particular places in the narrative, at the very start of a new annal in the text before starting the chronography of its events. They always begin with an identification of the year's caliph and sultan, and following that, they always appear in either one of 3 formal varieties. Most of these lists present local hierarchies of power. They focus entirely on presenting and identifying Syro-Egyptian formal hierarchies of power holders. Many add to that representations of wider regional power constellations. They focus on a West Asian political space, populated by the Sultanate's hierarchies and by the various Timurid and post-Mongol rulers to the north and east of the Sultanate. Some consist of global hierarchies of power. They present power constellations on an Afro-Eurasian scale, ranging from El-Hind in the east to Europe in the west, from Ethiopia in the south to the Kipchak steppes in the north. They present, as it were, a world that reminds of visual representations, such as the famous world map that Al-Idrisi constructed in the mid-12th century. Let me give you an example of each of these varieties in these chronicles. In volume 4 of al-Makrizi's Suluk, we find in the first pages for the annal of the year 840 a global list. A list that moves, and I've put up some details here which I will not repeat, but it's a list that moves from the Sultanate's hierarchy of caliph, sultan, emirs and governors to Shahrukh, the Timurid ruler, whose power according to Makrizi reached from Dilhi in al-Hind to the borders of Azerbaijan, and then the text moves on to various other rulers in East and West, including in al-Hind, in the so-called kingdoms of the Franks, and in the Bilad al-Habasha. Until finally the text moves back to what Makrizi identifies as the lords of the offices in Cairo. A second example we find in Al-Aini's Iqd al-Juman, the first pages for the annal of the year 841, which is more of a regional list. It's a list that moves from the Sultanate's hierarchy of caliph, sultan, emirs, administrators and governors to the Karamanid, Ottoman, Turkmen and Timurid rulers of Muslim West Asia. A third example we find in Ibn Tahribirdi's Hawadith, his continuation of al-Makrizi's Suluk. The first lines for the annal of the year 858 represent a local list, a list that focuses entirely on the Sultanate's hierarchy of sultan, caliph, emirs, identified here as lords of the offices, administrators, and then all kinds of governors. For every chronicle, the full picture of this structural listing and its variation along different spatial scales can be summarized as follows. In al-Makrizi's Suluk, al-Makrizi's Suluk seems to be the least structural of each of these chronicles. This habit of listing only appears from volume 4 onwards, not before. And lists do not feature at the beginning of every annal. In all, we only have 26 annals starting in this way in the entire Suluk. Most of these 26 lists concern local hierarchies of power. They focus on the leadership of the leaderships of the Sultanate. In 4 cases, this is expanded on a West Asian scale. In 3 cases, on a wider global scale. Then we have Al-Aini's Iqd al-Juman. In this case, every individual annal begins with a list, not just in the volumes that present contemporary events, but also in every preceding volume of the chronicle. If we look at the years 815 to 850, the 2 last volumes in the Iqd, we have then 36 lists in all, mostly representing local hierarchies of power, in 8 cases presenting West Asian ones, in 4 cases operating on a global scale. And then we have Ibn Tahribirdi's Hawadith, where again every annal begins with a list, mostly referring to local hierarchies of power, in 6 cases expanding on a West Asian scale, in 4 operating on a global scale. Finally, the second chronicle by Ibn Tahribirdi, his Dynastic Chronicle of Egypt's history and Syria, also has some lists, but not in the same systematic way. In fact, for the 15th century, there's only one list that at least I have been able to identify. A global one mentioned at the start of the extremely short and unsuccessful reign of Sultan al-Aziz Yusuf ibn Barzbai in 841. What we have here in general then are more than 90 lists of this kind, in the Suluk, in the Iqd, in the Hawadith, and even in the Nujum. All of these lists contribute to the analytic, or in the very limited case of the Nujum, the dynastic structuring of these chronicles. And they all operate on varying scales of contemporary political geography. Now, these lists have inspired many historians, and they have especially been made prolific use of, I think, by those working on the Sultanate's apparatus of government. As far as I'm aware, however, they have not been looked at seriously on the level of the texts in which they appear, nor from the perspective of how they contributed to the textual communication of these chronicles. One question that immediately comes to mind from this textual perspective is that of origins. Where does this tradition come from? What are its textual precedents? Among earlier generations of historians and scholars and historiographical texts, there certainly are quite a few precedents that may be identified. Very representative in this respect is the analytic chronicle Al-Bidayah wa Nihaya by the Damascene scholar Ibn Kathir. In this text, this habit of introductory listing starts appearing systematically for every individual year from the annal for 700 onwards. And it goes on until the Chronicles' last recorded year, 767. All of these lists are of the local type. They all focus on the political hierarchies of the Sultanate and especially on how Damascus and its religious elites fit in. There are also other earlier texts, and I've listed some here, and that also have similar lists, and they all follow Ibn Kathir's example, systematically opening their annals with a local type of listing. There's one different but also unique case, the Tarikh al-Malik Nasir Muhammad ibn Qalawun wa Awladihi by the scholar, soldier Shamsuddin al-Shujai. In the extant part of this annalistic chronicle, a list of rulers similarly introduces every annal. Some are extremely brief, but the longer ones take a deliberate regional and royal perspective. They identify the caliph and the sultan, and then they present brief surveys of the Muslim rulers of the lands to the north, east, and west of Cairo. So there certainly are precedents for the systematic appearance of lists of power holders in the chronicles of al-Makrizi, al-Aini, and Ibn Tahribirdi. But these 15th century texts seem to have added the novelty of diversifying, of moving within the text between different spatial scales from one annal to the other. They, moreover, seem to have added the particular novelty of occasionally even pushing this tradition to think on an unprecedented scale, on a much wider Afro-Eurasian scale. And this then brings up the question of the intertextual relationship between these texts themselves. And in fact, there are surprisingly few parallels or direct intertextual features that connect lists across these texts. Interestingly, the few cases where such connections seem to be existing are all related to these texts' handful of global listings. These connections may be summarized as follows. The global lists for 836 in Makrizi's Suluk and al-Aini's Ikt display substantial variation in the vocabulary that is used and in the order of some of the references. But there is also a clear interdependence noticeable, for they both refer to the same limited set of officials and rulers. And there's no time to go into detail here now. Then there's another obvious candidate for identifying these kind of direct intertextualities. The global lists in Makrizi's Suluk and al-Aini's Ikt for the year 840. In this case, however, there are just too many differences between these two lists to speak of any direct intertextual relationship. The only exceptions are the short references to what both authors refer to as the Muslim rulers of Al-Hind, the 17 kings of the Firanj, and the warring Muslim and non-Muslim rulers of Al-Habasha. These are presented in both texts in almost identical passages. These passages on the rulers of the Firanj and of Al-Habasha return in highly interrelated ways in Ibn Tahribirdi's annal for 854 in the Hawadith and in his annal for 841 in the Nujum. In the 841 case, however, the number of European kings is not 17 but 16. This different number then corresponds with how these realms of the Franks are also referred to in the list opening the Hawadith annal for 861. Now, the reference to either 17 or 16 unidentified so-called kings of the Franks appears very much, I think, as a topos that invites for further exploration, but I've not engaged with that right here. And the same is probably true for the shared references to the rulers of Al-Habasha and Al-Hind, which also remain quite generic in each of these chronicles. We have here a whole range of lists that share some features, but that are also different in many diachronic and synchronic ways, that thus display an interesting level of what we might call individuality. And this brings up our final concern with why these lists may have been constructed in these ways in these texts. In fact, at 3 occasions in the Nujum, Ibn Tahribirdi explains quite explicitly why he chose to add lists such as these. These explanations are all quite alike, and the most extensive one goes as follows. The value of what we have mentioned here, says Ibn Tahribirdi, the list of emirs and others who are lords of the offices, is to demonstrate how they all changed and were replaced by others within a short period in the early days of the Sultanate of Zahir Jakmak. And he refers to this particular list of 841. In this way, lessons will be learned about the ups and downs of fortune, about the fact that God is all-powerful over everything. The list of the rulers of the extremities of the world and their peers, however, is but a kind of digression, which nevertheless has some value and which does not entirely go beyond our present concern." Unquote. What we have here then are quite explicit references to the importance that is attached by Ibn Tahribirdi to instructing and informing his readers, to preparing them for the many changes in the structures of power that are to follow in the text. Seen from this perspective, these lists were considered by Ibn Tahribirdi as kind of narrative tools that helped him to navigate and guide his readers through the full complexity of his narrative, to the full complexity of the historical material with which it engaged. But these are also explicit references to how these lists were meant to teach readers a lesson about the ephemeral nature of power, about the transitory character of history. Seen from this perspective, these lists also enabled Ibn Tahribirdi, at least, to pursue the moral didactic purpose of his writings, to remind his readers of the ups and downs of fortune, about the absolute nature of God's power. In fact, it's highly likely that these narrative and moral didactic motifs and aspirations also inspired al-Makrizi and al-Aini to invest substantially in the integration of similar lists into their textual constructions. However, the question of what the added value of the extensive references to what Ibn Tahribirdi calls the rulers of the extremities of the world and their peers seems less straightforward to answer. The same narrative and moral didactic strategies may obviously apply, but there may also be more to this, related to the 15th century particularity, perhaps even individuality of many of these lists. It may at least be worthwhile to pursue further the idea that in their particular capacity of spatial variation on what we might call a globalizing scale from local to regional to global, that these lists actually compelled the authors, as well as anyone else engaging with these texts, to think about the world in which they lived. These lists sort of helped, even compelled authors and readers and anyone else to make or produce that world, in particular practical and discursive ways. In particular ways of writing, reading, speaking about, and imagining political order and structure on a globalizing scale, so that the world's political geography could be meaningfully connected with, even integrated into, that of the sultanates. Now, the discursive effect of this integration of the cosmic centrality, we might call it, of Cairo and its royal court is evident from the fixed organization of each and every one of these lists around the priority of the double authority of the caliph and the sultan. It is certainly also generated in Ibn Tahribirdi's impressive, and it's a very interesting one, geo and topographical tour of the world's main rulers for the year 861. In that case, he chooses to add to his discussion of the 6 Muslim rulers of Al-Hind, whom he identifies, that they, and I quote, all owe their investiture to the Abbasid Caliphate in Egypt. It is an image of political centrality that is produced, even performed, most explicitly and effectively in 2 lists in al-Makrizi's Suluk. First, there is the list for 824, where the text moves from Egypt and Syria over the Hijaz, Yemen and the Bilad al-Sharq to the Bilad al-Rum, ending its West Asian survey with the Muhtasib and Wali of Cairo and the Kashifs of Upper and Lower Egypt. The same effect of Cairo's political centrality is achieved in the aforementioned global list of 840, where the topical reference to the 2 rulers of Al-Habasha is succeeded, as we saw earlier, by the closing presentation of the Arbab al-Manasib bil-Qahira. Seen from this perspective, it may well be argued that the novelty of variation along a globalizing scale contributed in powerful ways to the appearance of the world as a spatial whole, to the idea of the absolute priority of the Sultanate's political order in that world. These 15th century listings of hierarchies of power certainly almost enforced such appearances and ideas upon their 15th century Arabophonic audiences. They still may be having similar structuring effects on modern students of the 15th century. If anything, I hope that these preliminary outcomes of my first engagements with these textual phenomena may at least have added some insight into these effects, whether they be narrative and didactic or also discursive and even political. Thank you.